Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Catalyst Story session, Breaking Story. I am your host and director of mentoring and partnerships, Jennifer Plotsky, and our guest today is Jackie Decembly. Jackie's writing focuses primarily on female-driven stories that explore complicated family dynamics, female friendship, and the idea of being a fish out of water. She has worked as a set production assistant, a line producer's assistant, a writer's production assistant. She was a writer's assistant on Netflix's Ginny and Georgia, a staff writer on Disney Plus's Turner and Hooch, and is currently a story editor for the 4400 on the CW. Wow. Welcome, Jackie. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So obviously you've worked a ton, so I would love to just dive right in because you, I'm sure, are a fountain of knowledge. So right off the bat, since we're talking about breaking story, what does breaking story mean for those that don't know, and why is it important?
Yeah, breaking story is basically like figuring out the beats or like the scenes of the story that you want to tell. So, like, if it's for your own writing, it's basically like, what's the story of your pilot, right? So
Right.
then you have to figure out what those scenes will be like, to tell your story. And that's basically what breaking story is. So, you're trying to figure out what scenes do I need to tell that story and how do I lay those out to tell it over a course of an episode.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you do that and when that's sort of decided, is that something that is fixed forever? Are there things that can change that during a season, or overall for the series?
Yeah, if you're working on a show, like things can change. It depends. And it's going to depend on the show, but like there are factors that can come up. So, say like the showrunner, who's the head writer, and usually is the person more times than not who has created the show, or they are like brought in to help a creator
Mhm.
run a show. But say that like they pitch out the season arc to the execs, the studio network, and let's say as we're breaking, I don't know, the episode like 3 or 4, they realize, oh wait, this is changing a little bit of where we want to go. So sometimes that'll happen.
Mhm.
Sometimes if you are on like a broadcast show like an ABC, CBS, CW show, maybe you've like decided two actors, like their characters are going to be a couple, and you start shooting, and then you're like, oh wait, this chemistry is not like what we thought it was going to be. Then
Right.
maybe that's a reason why something has changed. It's kind of different for streaming because usually
Mhm.
all the episodes are written usually all first, and then
Okay.
they go ahead and film. With broadcast, you kind of like have some episodes that you have scripts for, and then you start shooting, and then production kind of catches up with you with the writing.
Right.
So
Sort of writing as you go.
yeah, so it's a little different. So the things that could change, it
Mhm.
depends on the like what type of show you are on. And the other thing that could maybe change is that maybe the network or studio is like, hey, we're not sure about this storyline now.
Mhm.
So there's just some reasons why things might change.
Okay. Gotcha. And so in terms of that, like if you're writing for, a network like you said, or stream, depending on what you're writing for, how about the people that are writing like their own pilots, people that are working outside of a writer's room, um, a spec script or something like that? What materials or references feed that process for someone in that position?
Yeah, I think whenever I'm like writing my own like samples, I usually think, you have like kind of like a loose idea of like,
Mhm.
oh, whatever the story is going to be. I think I want to write a pilot about this. I try to like brainstorm or find shows that are similar, like in the same. Because I usually write dramedy scripts, so I am looking for shows that are similar. That's probably the first thing I do is make a list. I like crowdsource and I'll ask friends and,
Mhm.
hey, like, is there a show that does X, Y, and Z if I haven't seen it? And then I'll watch the show. It depends on the show. Like sometimes I'll just watch the pilot. Maybe I'll watch like the whole first season. And then if I can get my hands on a script, I'll also read the script. So for me, that's really important so I can kind of see what do they do? And like, how am I
Mhm.
doing? What am I doing differently? Like, I like what they did here, but like, how am I making it my own? Just kind of have that sense. And I think it also helps with structure too, to kind of
Mhm.
see, oh, this pilot has 5 acts, and like, oh, am I going to do that for my pilot, or am I going to do 6 acts? So I kind of like use it as a reference. And then what was the other part of that question? I'm sorry.
Um, what materials? Oh, well, I guess you kind of touched on that. Yeah, it was just materials or references that feed that process, which
Yeah, I think those are probably like the two biggest thing is like just reading other scripts and watching other TV.
Mhm.
And then I also like my biggest resource is like other writers. I'm in a writers group. I'm in actually two, so I have people read, and then I have a couple friends who are also TV writers that will also read too. So
that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So then once you make it to the writer's room, what is it like in the writer's room? How does it work? How does this process work?
yeah, it's a really great process. I really like, writing can feel very I don't want to say isolating, but like you're doing it by yourself. But I really like having other perspectives and voices, because you kind of, it helps you like, oh, I never thought about it that way, or I missed this. Like, so having like these group of people to like all trying to make a show together, like it's a really awesome thing. I don't know, it just makes the stories, I think, richer when you have more than one person contributing and working. And I think it's a lot of fun. I like being in the room. But basically, like, so breaking story when you're in a room is kind of the same a little bit, like, at least for me with my process. So I get an idea, right?
Mhm.
So I'm like, okay, I want to do this. So, like, in a room, it's usually the showrunner. Hey, I have an idea. Like, this is what I think this episode's going to be about. And depending on the showrunner, they could come in like, this is the shape of the episode.
Mhm.
Some showrunners do that, or they go, "Oh, this is this little thing. I know I want this to happen. Like, I know the beginning part maybe, and I know the end, and we need to figure out the middle." So it
Gotcha.
kind of depends on who you're working with, like what they bring, but they're
Mhm.
going to come in with something, right? So then we start talking. They call it blue skying. That could be like 1 to 3 days, depending on your schedule or how your room works, where you're just like all the ideas of like what could happen in this episode,
Mhm.
basically framing it around whatever they've brought to the room, the showrunner. So then you kind of talk about that. And then once you have those couple of days of blue skying, the showrunner is like, okay, this is the direction I want to go in. So they're leading the process of like, this is what I would like to do. So
Okay.
then you try to come up with a shape of like, this is what the episode's going to look like, and you try to come up with those beats, those scenes to fit the stories that you're telling. So you're usually going to have like a B and C story, maybe a D story too. And you're
Right.
like, what scenes do we need to do to tell this story in this episode? And then you kind of like go from the beats,
Mhm.
and then you, okay, let's talk about this. And then on a show, you have to have like a, they call it a story area. It's basically a sales document, is what I like to call it, for your studio and network to say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing in this episode. So then they see it. You have a notes call. They'll have questions about it, and then from there, you go through and eventually get to an outline. There's a couple
Mhm.
other steps in between, but once you get approved for the story, you go back through, you have all the scenes that you think you need for each story. Then we do what is called like a blend. That means putting all of the scenes together and like, this is what the episode's going to look like. And then in that blend, which is, I kind of do the same thing when I'm doing my own work. You go, oh, wait, together, like this scene doesn't fit here, or wait, I don't need this scene, or
Mhm.
kind of figure out what needs to go or what needs to be added. And then from that, like you go into what we call like a fine break, which is you go through every single scene of the episode, and you talk about, again, making sure we're not like missing any plot points, any like, make sure all of our characters their arcs make sense for the episode.
Mhm.
And sometimes you get dialogue pitches, other little details that we want to put in the scenes, and then it gets to an outline. So it's kind of like it's a process, but
Yeah.
it's a good process though because I'm like very into structure. So for me, I love it because I'm like, oh, you get to see it, and you hopefully get to like set yourself up for success once you like, go writing. That you have all of the things that you need. Now, that's not to say that like when you write that you don't find stuff like, oh wait, this doesn't work. But you
Sure.
try to set yourself up as best as you can.
Right, right, that makes sense. Um, so in talking about that, kind of in that vein, like, what tools are used to track a story arc, either for an episode or for a season? Um, yeah, like, how is that working over time?
Yeah. Well, back in the before times, as I like to call them, when we were in person, doing these breaking stories together, you would have like a whiteboard and
Mhm,
do like cards of, oh, these are what the scenes are going to be. And you could move the cards around, like, oh, wait, that doesn't go here. This should go in act one. This should go in act five. Um, and you would have like a character board for all of your characters, and you kind of track it for the whole season.
mhm,
Um, and then you might have another board with like the episodes, like, this is how our season's going to run out, like, or lay out over the course of the season. Uh, but since now a lot of rooms are still Zooming,
mhm,
using something called Writers Room Pro or like Miro. I'm forgetting another one, but basically software that you can have a virtual whiteboard that
mhm.
kind of does the same thing.
Oh, cool.
So you have cards that you can like move around and like
Mhm,
write in, type in, I should say. And we have that for the shows that I've been on. So you're keeping track of like, again, episode by episode of
mhm.
like what you've done. And again, that'll change as you break it because you start off like, this is what we want to do in this episode. And maybe the episodes change or things change. You do a character one. We did character episode. I'm missing a board, but yeah, and then the actual board when you're breaking for each episode, like
Okay,
specifically, you have like how you break it with each scene and within the acts and things like that. So that's the tool that we're using now.
wow.
Yeah,
Technology is just fascinating.
it is. It is.
So, as you're putting all of this together, like, how do you test or refine what stays in, and how do you figure out what's missing?
Yeah, that goes back to that blend I was talking about earlier,
Mhm,
where we kind of like have that virtual board and you have all of your acts, and then you like the showrunner and the rest of the room, you kind of go through and you talk about each scene and make sure like no one doesn't have like, there's no like questions or, oh wait, did we forget something? I thought this person was supposed to do that in act four. So
right.
you're kind of like trying to, it's one of your like testing moments.
Yeah.
And then before the episode gets off the board, meaning you're done with breaking it and it goes off to outline, you do
Mhm,
that fine break again of like the last looks, so to say, like if you're on set, like last looks, you just kind of go through one more time to make sure, again, you're not missing something. Now, are you good at this? Like, does stuff happen when you're writing? Yes, things always like happen. You
mhm,
find other things, you're like, oh, wait, but that's kind of the test. And I should also say, for any episode, you're going to have notes from
right,
your studio, from your network. You might have it from your non-writing producers. So that's another way too that you're, you know, kind of making sure you're not forgetting anything.
right. Can I ask what is the timeline for something like this look like? Either for one episode or for, because it sounds like it's, I mean, obviously it's a very detailed process.
Mhm.
I'm just sort of wondering, like, I'm sure that you guys, when you're in person, you're just in the room for hours on end. But, what would a whole season or an episode look like? Just a ballpark.
It's so interesting because I was on a streamer the first time. So it depends on the room and like the
Mhm,
pace. So sometimes people like can break an episode in 8 days.
mhm,
Sometimes it can take 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
It just kind of depends on the amount of time you have and like what your production schedule looks like, you
Sure.
know.
Yeah.
But for broadcast, for example, for 4400, you have more time at the beginning, right?
Mhm.
Because you start before production is starting. But then, like I said, that's that train that, like, once the train starts, things start to catch up. So once they start filming, that time really becomes it. For us, I think, I don't know what episode it happened, but it happens on any broadcast show that, like, you're ahead and then you're and you're
And then
not.
you're not.
So the days that you have, they shrink for the amount
Mhm.
of time that you can break an episode. And
Yeah.
depends on how far behind you are, like, how many days you can spend. Like, you might only break it in less than 8 days. It could be 7 days you have to break it. And then, the writer might have only X amount of days to write it. So it kind of just, it depends on the
Wow.
schedule.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, that makes sense. Um, so can you break down is there a basic outline for hour-long formatting in a pilot, for example?
Yeah, I think, and again, it depends on what people's processes are for, like, when
Mhm,
they're doing it by themselves. For me, I love a detailed outline.
mhm,
So I will go through and I will have all of my acts, all of my scenes. I try to put as much information for myself as possible. If you're doing it for a show, it might be a little bit different. Sometimes the showrunner doesn't want to give too much information because then there's like questions, right? Because it's an outline. You can't There's only so much you can put into it without making it like a billion pages long. So uh, you typically try to keep it within a certain page length
mhm,
if you're working on a show. If it's
right,
for you, I mean, it's however long you want your outline to be. I
right,
try not to go too long if I'm like having other people read it. So,
mhm,
again, I think the longest outline I've seen maybe like 16 pages,
okay,
for like a show, like
mhm,
being on a TV show. And then I think probably around the same for someone's personal 1 hour, you know, pilot, probably around the same 16, maybe 17. But you really don't want it to be like 30 pages. Just because, yeah, not that you would show that to anyone. If you did 30 pages, maybe it's for yourself, but like maybe not showing 30 pages of an outline because it's like almost a script, right?
right,
So,
right.
um,
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, so that's kind of like the formatting of the outline I kind of use, I think.
Okay. Um, and so I guess just in general,
Mhm.
what advice do you have for breaking stories successfully? I mean, I know like like you've talked about, it's obviously a collaboration, and it's probably different in each room. But is there, a piece of advice that you have personally that has helped you?
Yeah, I rely heavily, heavily on doing research for myself. So I really do read a lot of scripts when I can. And if it's a project, like, for example, I know that I want to write a period piece at some point this year. So I already watch a lot of period dramas, but like, again, if I know there are specific ones that lean more towards the idea that I have, I'm going
Mhm,
to be focusing on that, trying to get those scripts if I can. I My friends who read, not my writers group, but like outside of that, if I know someone else has written something that is in that same genre or whatever, I might try to have that friend read it because they're used to like reading that kind of stuff or writing that.
right.
And I mean, there's some books too, depending on what you're working on. There are a couple. I don't have any on my. Do I have any up here? No, I don't. But looking at my bookshelf, sorry. But you can. There's books about structure. I know
Mhm,
Save the Cat has like structure stuff too that people will also use while they're breaking their own pilot. Um, I have like a couple books about, character and traits and
mhm,
things like that, professions, just all kind of things that like I might tap into if I'm like hitting like a style, like I feel stuck and I like need help, then I will use books and stuff too to kind of help me, you know, continue breaking my pilot.
If you could touch on what are acts and what are story beats and or elements, that are generally happening in each?
Yes. So depending again on your pilot or where you like, if it's going to be on a certain network, sometimes certain networks only do 5 acts or might do 6 acts. So that will kind of decide that for you.
Mhm.
For example, on the CW, on the 4400, we had 6 acts in our show.
Okay.
Didn't have a teaser, and a teaser is basically like you're teasing a potential situation or whatever is going to happen in the episode. Some shows have a teaser, and then they go to like their commercial break, then you come back. But for
Mhm.
us, it was all just one act one. And in act one, you're basically just, kind of like setting up your introing your characters who are going to be in the episode. You kind of like build to maybe what the conflict might be, or you'll get at least a hint of what's going to be going on, what the characters are going to have to face or overcome. And then you're kind of building to that moment where you have either a cliffhanger. It's to get to the commercial break, right? So you're building to that moment.
Right.
And then act two, the characters are struggling with that conflict that got presented in act one, maybe, or the conflict is actually introduced in act two. And then depending on if you have a 5 act or 6 acts, the next acts kind of like can be interchangeable or might move a little bit, is what it
Mhm.
is. So act three, you kind of like the character or characters are like, oh, they might think that they have the solution to the problem, right? But then something happens, something else happens. There's some kind of twist or flip, and they're like, oh, wait, shoot, I don't know how to like fix this now. And that's again, you're trying to propel the story forward.
Right.
And then in the other act, so it's kind of like that low point, more or less of like, oh wait, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. Um, you know, it's kind of like that the dark night of the soul that people talk about, like, oh, what am I going to do? And they're like doubting if they're going to be able to figure it out. And then you kind of go from there, and hopefully like there is a little bit of hope that might come next, right? In the whatever act you're in after that. And whatever hope, they're like, oh wait, maybe I do know how to fix this situation. And then you'll have your climax, which could be depending if you have act 4 or 5, depending on whatever the 5 or 6 structure that you're using. And then you'll have that climax, that moment of, hopefully um, overcoming whatever the obstacle is. And
Mhm.
then that last act is basically kind of like the resolution, resolving everything. You're tying up the loose ends for that problem. And then maybe you could be kind of setting something up for the following. It depends on what the show is. You could be setting up something else for um, the next episode if it's like for
Right.
TV.
Right. Wow, it's just such a fascinating process, and what
Mhm.
a cool thing to, to work in a room like that and, in person or virtually, no matter how you do it, like, it's just sounds like, you're really just submersed in the world, and it's so cool.
Yeah, it's a good time. It's a lot of fun, and you get to talk about stories. Like,
Yeah.
it's an awesome job.
I can imagine. Oh my gosh. Well, congratulations on all the work that you've been doing, and
Thank you.
we're really looking forward to seeing more and keeping track of what you're doing. So I congratulations, and again, thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing your wisdom and insight. It's really helpful.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Brought to you by the Catalyst Story Institute.